Bob, thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, you're quite welcome.
So listen, I'd like to go back and understand from you a little bit about your past. I know that you are from Italy, and so give me a little bit about your background about your family.
Well, my family's from Italy. I was born here in the U.S., and my mom was as well. But my grandparents came over, I guess probably their parents came over in the late 1800s. And the whole family's from Naples. And the family migrated to New York City. And as I noted in my book, I had some colorful ancestors who were associated with a fellow by the name of Lucky Luciano, who was a mobster, kind of internationally known. Just because I had some relatives who made that mistake has nothing to do with me whatsoever, but it did cause me to grow up in a neighborhood and around people who were involved in that world. And so when it came for me to play the role of a mob-connected money launderer, I think I had an advantage because I know that world, I understand that world a little bit. And I had investigated that world and prosecuted people within that world for 14 years before I did this long-term undercover assignment. So, but the other side of my family are all from Poland. So I'm half Polish and half Italian.
What a lovely mix. What a really fantastic mix. So tell me, just going back again a little bit earlier, what led you to go into a career of law enforcement when clearly you were surrounded with maybe not the best, guidance and maybe not in the best area? Why did you choose law enforcement?
Well, I did have a good, great guidance from my mom and dad. And no one in our family had been to college before my brother went. And so I and he were the first ones in the family to ever attend college. And my mom was vehemently opposed to us being involved in anything other than getting a great education and trying to get begin a good career. So when I went to school, I took business administration, finance, and accounting. And by sheer accident, one day I was looking for a job during the summer as well as during the semester. And there was an announcement for a position as a co-op student at an agency then called the IRS Intelligence Division, which made absolutely no sense to me. I didn't really know what they did, but it was a job. So I quickly learned when I got there that this was the agency that was responsible for the prosecution of Al Capone. They're the ones that followed the money, that documented the fact that he was involved in all these illegal activities and had evaded income taxes. And as I was involved in that office and I saw the types of cases they were working on, now I was otherwise headed toward a career as a CPA. And one of the cases they were working on became a movie, American Gangster, with Denzel Washington, where he played Frank Lucas, the biggest heroin trafficker in New York. And people from the office that I was in at the time were doing surveillances at a bank, aptly named Chemical Bank, to be involved with somebody involved in drugs. But they were watching these huge deliveries of currency and a failure of that to be reported. And I just thought, this is going to be a very interesting thing. I really didn't know when I went to the office. I really didn't know what I would be doing that day. I did know that it was going to be something that I would see from a distance that was exciting. I mean, believe me, as a co-op student, I basically did photocopying and carrying people's bags, but it put me close to the law enforcement world. And I was just completely drawn by the fact that the major criminals in the world, the highest level criminals, their vulnerability, their Achilles heel was the money flow. Because being able to follow the illicit money flow took you to the owners of the money and gave you an opportunity to prosecute the people who most affected crime on the streets. And that just completely captured me.
I can absolutely imagine. And so, but was the undercover element as well very attractive to you, or was that a natural progression?
It was interesting to me, but it was a natural progression. Thankfully, I was in an agency that recognized that before you did long-term undercover work, you needed to go through psychological profiling and undercover school training. And had I not had that benefit, I would have been more likely to crash and burn, because living a double life for years on end is a very, very strange experience. Things, unfortunately, you experience changes that are kind of normal reactions to a very abnormal environment. And you can be exposed to things like Stockholm syndrome and beginning to gravitate emotionally toward your targets. And there are a lot of things that I'm so grateful that I worked for an agency that had the foresight to have that type of training, because I know many, many law enforcement officers who even with that training wound up going down a slippery slope that led to them, in some instances, losing their careers, many times their families, and sometimes their freedom.
I mean, it's incredible, absolutely incredible, and it's actually beautifully portrayed in the film. And if people haven't watched it, they must watch The Infiltrator. I think it was very well done. What is it like? Can you describe to me what is it like to actually go into the underworld and work in international criminal organizations?
Well, it's something that has to be well planned out. And again, I was blessed when I had leadership that recognized that after I was trained, I needed time to put a plan together. And I had about a year and a half time to really backstop the operation that I ultimately, with my partner, wound up using in an undercover capacity. And I have to stop here and say that it's really important for me to tell everyone that this platform that I get to speak from about these issues in reality was built by a team. And I had the privilege of being a member of that team and an honor of earning ultimately a leadership role on that team. But it's the team that really made it happen. And so having had 18 months with some very good informants, and taking us back to Italy again, two of the informants were Italian-American organized crime associates, and one was a person in Colombia who was involved in the import-export business. But I was embedded in real businesses, an investment company, a mortgage brokerage business. We had a jewelry chain with 30 locations on the East Coast, an air charter service with a private jet, and even a brokerage firm with a seat on the New York Stock Exchange. So I didn't have to be the best undercover agent in the world. I was given the training, I was given the time, and I was given the resources to put a Trojan horse together that was pulled into the underworld's castle, because it had all the trappings that they were looking for. And another thing that I think really helped was the fact that with undercover training, I know what it means to try to create passive reinforcements, to get people to perceive you to be something you don't want to have to tell them, but you want them to believe you are. And in order to really anchor that, one technique we used is my partner, who was more of a street guy, picking up money on the streets, would always, for the first 6 months, he was the only one undercover. And he kept talking about his boss, Mr. Big, who wanted to stay in the shadows, never wanted to meet anybody. And basically we played hard to get. And at the end of the 6 months, they were begging to meet me. And that really gave me an advantage. And at that stage, we started a 2 years of living a double life in the Infiltrator story. During that time, my partner and I recorded about 1,200 conversations. And that was the cornerstone, not only for the prosecution of drug traffickers, but I think most importantly, the Infiltrator story shows that we became a conduit for what was then the 7th largest privately held bank in the world. And I wound up dealing with people at the board level in an institution that employed about 15,000 people and had a presence in 72 countries. And it was very, very clear from the recordings and the evidence that we collected that there was an institutional interest to solicit funds from the underworld. Basically, they helped clients who were seeking secrecy, had money that was seeking secrecy from government. So whether you're a drug trafficker, an arms dealer, somebody evading income taxes, a terrorist, the same techniques were being used by the bank for the benefit of them pulling people in from whom they solicited deposit relationships. And that was really for the bank what it was all about, deposits. That's what they were looking for. That was their quid pro quo. If you leave deposits with us on June 30th and December 31st, when our financial statements are taken, we'll help you. So that gave me an opportunity to get inside the international banking and business community to witness firsthand how a segment, and I hope in my heart it's a small segment, but there is a segment of the international banking and business community that solicits relationships with organized criminal groups and provides money laundering services to them. I was taught how to launder money by the brightest lawyers, bankers, financial service providers, and corrupt businessmen on the planet. And I love to take that message to the community of financial institutions to help them to understand the types of geographic areas, the types of businesses, the types of products, the types of transactions they need to be on the lookout for that are very, very prevalent in the movement of illicit funds. And I don't care if those funds are moving in Estonia, Panama, Madrid, Rome, and now China, much more than in many other parts of the world. There are fundamentals about money laundering that you absolutely need to know in order for you to be able to maximize the limited resources you have to protect your institution. And although I do believe that the greatest amount of knowledge about that is something that happens commonly decade after decade with continuity and style, there are new things that it's important for me to study, and I study these issues 24/7, so that I am on top of the latest money laundering cases and things that are emerging. And I like to combine my real life experience as a money launderer with my study as an expert witness to bring the best information I can to businesses and companies that really need to protect themselves and the reputation of their institutions.
That's fantastic. That's really brilliant. And it's scary stuff, as you say, in terms of, dealing with board level of a huge organization. And you've touched on this, and I'd like you to expand on it for me, because obviously you've taken this now into a speaking and consulting business, and you have your own consultancy. Who are the audiences that you are helping? Who are the people? You mentioned financial institutions. Is it solely financial institutions, or are there other businesses that need to be aware of money laundering?
Oh, there are many businesses that need to be aware. The U.S. and many governments recognize not just banks as financial institutions, but money service businesses, casinos. There are many requirements for due diligence, enhanced due diligence within many sectors of the business world. But I also, so most of the people, when I'm in the private sector and I'm presenting master classes or keynotes, I'm talking to people who are involved in, many others are involved in IT, in artificial intelligence, in providing services to institutions. They are as interested as the institutions themselves, because their products are designed to try to identify what these suspicious transactions normally look like. And unless they have that knowledge, they can't program their computers to catch that type of activity. But financial service providers, I was in the BVI and I talked to many financial service providers and attorneys and representatives of banks. And then I also do my best to try to also share time with the law enforcement community. I have a lot of continued friends and brothers and sisters that are actively in the law enforcement world. And I not only offer them training with respect to money laundering, but also with regard to managing undercover informants, managing informants, and other types of police protocols that really are things that are high risk. And so there's a huge array of people that I luckily get the opportunity to speak with, and it's very, very rewarding for me. I enjoy it very much.
Fantastic, and we're glad you're doing it. And you mentioned the fact that you keep current. And I suppose one of the challenges in keeping current is the fact that technology is moving so fast. Is the technology making it harder, or is it making it easier for you to identify money laundering?
Well, you know, the technology that's developed, there are businesses that weren't really around that provide services that now do, which can be exploited. Now, I'll give you an example. That would be the telecom industry, especially a tier two telecom that's buying bandwidth, cloud space from a tier one provider. If I was a money launderer again, which never will happen, but if I was a money launderer again, I would be looking toward the telecom industry, because when you have a business that sells products that are difficult to measure, it gives you an opportunity to provide an influx of illicit funds within your existing business. So think about prepaid cards for telephone use. How does anyone really measure the value? And I've seen people produce prepaid cards that were worthless and sell it from one country to another just to generate a reason for moving money across borders. How do you really determine how much cloud space was spent, how much broad bandwidth was spent? And now telecoms are involved in actually sending money using PINs with their phones. And now we're talking about a situation where not only are they doing that, but now they are buying brick buildings which are going to interface with the phones so that they can allow their customers to actually send from their phone to a brick building and allow that bank to then wire transfer. Those are all types of new things in technology that had to give consideration to 20 years ago. But we certainly better be thinking about it now, because it is a very, very easy way in which things can be exploited. Now, another thing that really is, today's issue is cryptocurrency. My view on cryptocurrency is that it has a place, unfortunately, in typical illegal type activity, but mostly, I think, in things like ransomware peddlers and identity theft and hackers and tax refund frauds. If you look at the hack of $83 million out of JP Morgan, and then there was the case of Silk Road, where there was on the dark net, people who were selling on a user and slightly above user level illicit drugs and doing cryptocurrency. But there are some very sound reasons why a money launderer, like I once was, who worked in the black money markets, would be fearful of getting involved in cryptocurrencies. You have to understand that when you're a launderer, you're working on a percentage of the value of what you move. And if what you move, if you're not using a stable currency, it's one of the reasons why the US dollar and the euro are so popular with money launderers. Because look at the volatile value of cryptocurrencies. There are lots of investors. Investors go in and they come out, and then we have hackings, and then we have IPOs that are being offered as cryptocurrency, new cryptocurrency companies that many times turn out to be scams. And there is, the bad guy world knows, there is a blockchain technology here that's a roadmap to the path. And there was a case just a couple of months ago with a gentleman who was involved in Silk Road 6 years ago. He was selling under a fictitious name. I mean, that's an advantage of cryptocurrency. You just need a username and a password and an email. And the electronic footprint chatting about details are there, but you can hide yourself as being someone other than who you really are. But aside from that fact, the blockchain technology causes there to be an easy way for those who have the technology to do it to identify where that Bitcoin came from. So this guy comes out of the woodwork 6 years later and tries to trade in millions of dollars of Bitcoin, saying that he had mined it over years. When you go to and you were talking before about other people who need to know, well, people who are brokers for Bitcoin, people you go to with cash or checks or money wires to buy Bitcoin, they are money service businesses. They have to do the same thing that a bank has to do. They have to report large cash transactions, suspicious activity reports. So this guy goes to a Bitcoin exchange and tries to exchange millions of dollars in Bitcoin for cash. And what happens is that guy files a suspicious activity report, calls the law enforcement authorities. They freeze the account. They use the blockchain technology, and they clearly put this cryptocurrency into Silk Road, being paid to the guy who was selling under a name Farmville all types of illicit drugs. So for that reason, it's not the most attractive thing to big time drug traffickers. As younger people get involved, I imagine there's going to be more of a lean in that direction. But if I'm a money launderer and I'm planning on making 10% on a transfer, and if I'm doing it in cryptocurrency and I get it, and on that day the cryptocurrency is worth X, and on the day I deliver it, it's minus 10%, I don't make any money. I don't have to worry about that with the dollar or the euro. The transactions are going to happen fairly quickly, but still, it is not something that I would be comfortable with because of its volatility, because of its the ability to link the transactions that occur through it. And so that's just my view on where Bitcoin sits in the world of Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies sit in the world of the illicit world.
That's fascinating. And I noticed you didn't mention the British pound sterling. Let's not talk about that because it will lead us onto a different topic. And I'm a bit scared to ask this question because I have a horrible feeling it's not going to be a positive answer. I hope it is. Are institutions and law enforcement agencies better at catching the bad guys today, would you say?
You know, I would say that with respect to what I kind of call the low-hanging fruit, yes. There are many suspicious activity reports that are filed by financial institutions. The problem that we face, I think, if you look very closely at the last 15 years or even the last 10 years, the unbelievable number of deferred prosecutions whereby major institutions have admitted criminal conduct in conjunction with their movement of illicit funds. I track, there's at least 15 or 18 of them. When we prosecuted the BCCI bankers, and I got the opportunity to debrief them after they were sentenced, and they realized they needed to do something to try to get their sentences reduced. They said, I don't understand why you guys are picking on us. We're not doing anything different than the rest of the international banking community. We never started our career with BCCI. We started with other institutions. And when we got to BCCI, we took what we thought were the best techniques that were being used in the international banking community and tried to improve on them a little bit. But believe me, it's happening around the world. When they told me that, I really didn't buy it. I mean, I knew that there were some banks that were doing it, but I didn't realize how broad this problem was. If you look at just a few cases, Wachovia Bank wound up admitting to the fact that they had laundered a large amount of money for Mexican cartels. And they moved into the United States in a period of just under 3 years, $14 billion in US currency from account holders that they established relationships with that were principally houses of exchange, casas de cambio. They didn't even have branches in Mexico. They sent officers down there to solicit these relationships and wound up ultimately admitting that their position, they admitted to a criminal offense called intentionally failing to maintain an anti-money laundering compliance program. To me, that's legal speak. They laundered money. And you look at HSBC admitting to the fact that they moved nearly $1 billion for the Sinaloa cartel and the Norte de Valle cartel, the biggest ones in both Mexico and Colombia. And their repatriation of currency made the Wachovia Bank case look like child's play. So those cases involving major institutions that admitted that they have strip wire information so that they could get around the sanctions against Iran and other countries. I guess the most recent drug-related one I can think of was Rabobank, which had branches along the Mexican-U.S. border and took in unbelievable amounts of U.S. currency deposits, clearly money from, illicit account holders. So there's a long, long history here, unfortunately, of those types of problems. Having said that, I can tell you this. I do believe that most banks have two brains. One brain is a compliance brain. That compliance brain, in my view, 99.99999% of the people in the compliance world are well-intended, hardworking, very focused people trying to mitigate risk. On the other hand, you have a sales brain, and the sales brain is motivated in a different fashion financially by the institution itself. They get a base salary plus a commission based upon deposits that are brought in. Now, it's not hard to imagine that if I'm a sales guy and I have an account relationship, and even if I have no ill intent, because of the fact that this is directly related to my salary, I may be seeing the glass half full while the compliance people are seeing it half empty. And when I talk to compliance people, and I've talked to thousands and thousands of compliance people, and I say, tell me if this isn't the experience you're having. Senior management tells you that sales wants to establish an account relationship with a client A. You guys look into it and you go, wow, we shouldn't walk away from this. We should run away from this because this is definitely got all the flags of being an illicit funds coming through the account. The salespeople then say, well, compliance really doesn't know this industry well. I'm telling you, we know this, we know these people, they're only dealing with the best people in the world. And then ultimately management sides with sales. Compliance is shut down. There are ways to get around that. And the best ways, in my view, to get around that is we need to help management to recognize that we have to get sales to embrace the goals of compliance while still enabling them to be successful in what they do. And how do you do that? Well, one of the senior bank officers I talked with told me, he was the head of the private client division in North America for a large bank. And he said, listen, we don't have compliance problems. And I started chuckling and saying, yeah, right. I hear that from everybody who's running a private client division. But he said, no, we don't, because here's the position. My management has told me, if we bring in an account and we share the information with compliance, and if compliance's position is that we shouldn't onboard the account, but we vehemently oppose that, we give our evidence as to why, under my personal service contract with the bank, if later on management goes with us and defers the compliance position, I'm personally responsible twofold for any losses that the bank incurs with respect to the onboarding of that account. He said, listen, compliance is my friend. I've got to get them to take this account and bring it on, because if not, then it's on my shoulders. And there are things like that that you can do that I believe can change the balance within the two-brain bank. But right now, until we get that corrected, I think we're going to continue to see more problems than we really want to.
And yeah, absolutely, and it makes sense. The way you explain it makes absolute sense. So if the banks are able to do this, what would you say law enforcement authorities should be doing to combat money laundering? What's the most important thing they should be looking at?
Sure. I think, first of all, if we're going to have any real effect on the major money laundering cases around the globe, it requires true international cooperation. We absolutely have to have that at the highest possible level that we can. And I believe that if you look closely at most of the major money laundering cases, probably the most recent one that's worth mentioning was the prosecution of a guy by the name of Kanani, Altaf Kanani. So Altaf Kanani had currency exchange houses all over the world and couriers all over the world who could pick up money. And he was doing business pretty much as the Goldman Sachs of the underworld. There wasn't any criminal organization in the world that he wasn't inclined to work with. And that in that particular case, he just got sentenced this year. They documented that he had moved $14 to $16 billion a year, and in mostly illicit funds. Now, that case was developed because of informants on the inside. So human resources are extremely important, but we can't wait until we have an informant stumble across a situation to report that type of thing. If we're going to be good at this, I think what we need to do is we need to get government to proactively put a task force together that has no responsibility other than on a continuing basis attempting to identify the 10 major money laundering threats within their borders. Now, how do you go about doing that? I talked before about the cash. You know, people talk about, well, there's these new approaches with cryptocurrency and this, that, and the other thing. Well, guess what? These cartels are stuck with cash because nobody in South Chicago is buying crack cocaine or methamphetamine with Bitcoin. And they are not there with wire transfers or checks. They're there with cash. So ultimately, they're stuck with trunkloads of cash. And if we could just get true cooperation from globally, from our central banks, we could, on a continuing basis, identify areas of hotspots where it would appear that money laundering activity is flourishing. And I say that because of a story told to me by one of the BCCI officers why he still thought I was a bad guy. And what he said to me one night was, Bob, who do you think the biggest money launderer in the United States? Oh, not who. He said, do you know who the biggest money launderer is in the United States? And I'm a young agent and I'm thinking, my goodness, I'm going to get some great information. And he says, well, it's the Federal Reserve, of course. And I said, what? And he said, let me tell you the story. This is the reality and the hypocrisy of this war on drugs. He said, in Colombia at the time, it was illegal for any Colombian citizen to have a US dollar account. So there was no reason for US dollars to necessarily be inside the borders of of Colombia, at least not in a huge volume. But what really was happening is the Bank of the Republic in Colombia had a thing called the sinister window or the anonymous window. And you could go there with all the cash, US cash you had, and exchange it for Colombian pesos anonymously and get a very good exchange rate. And he said to me, what do you think the Bank of the Republic does with the US currency after they receive it through the sinister window? I don't know. He said, well, they put it on pallets, they shrink wrap it, and then they send it to the Federal Reserve because they are a member bank of the Federal Reserve. And so now this money gets shipped into the Federal Reserve. He said, don't you think there's someone at the Federal Reserve with enough smarts to go, wait a minute, this is a country that has made it illegal to have US dollars, but we're getting hundreds of millions of dollars a month in currency from them. And thinking about that, now let's take that to today. If we could get the Federal Reserve to provide us with information, identifying the sources from which currency is repatriated to them, this would identify financial institutions around the world. If then, with the help of the central bank in the respective countries, we could put pressure on those institutions to disclose the identity of the account holders who are providing them with this excessively huge amount of cash, we would come through the back door and we would know where the cash is actually coming from. Couple that with other things that we don't do in law enforcement. There are major bad guys sitting in prison as we speak today. Miguel Rodriguez Orjuela and his brother, the two heads of the Cali cartel. Fabio Ochoa, the head of the Medellin cartel. Many other people who are sitting in prisons around the world. After they have either pled guilty or been convicted, there's nothing to prevent you from, and I believe we should, bring them before a grand jury and question them in great length about their financial affairs and who within the financial institutions, businesses, and others were involved in helping them to move that money. they can make a decision. They can say, I don't want to answer because it would incriminate me. At which point in time you can get them immunity and force them. And if they don't testify in the United States, they will now get what we call downtime and lose the time that they would otherwise gain toward their sentence for periods of 18 months at a time. And I would continue to do that to them until they wound up providing the information that we need. When I was in DEA and I had a suspicion about a particular Swiss bank, I remember the day that I ran in our NATIS system, it's an narcotics intelligence system, the name of that bank. The printouts that I got naming that bank linked to various drug cases was probably 18 inches high of paper. And as I went through it, it was clear search warrants around the world that were being executed identified this institution to have had accounts that were controlled by certain bad guys, narcotics traffickers. When you look for those types of patterns and you use the information that's sitting there and take a long-term approach, we can do a much, much better job. I wrote an article. People can find it on my website because there's a publications page with articles by me and articles about me. But I wrote one about what I thought would be the best global plan for identifying the major money launderers of the world and prosecuting them. I lay that out in detail there. And I think there's a lot that we can do that we're not doing. What we do is a lot of, unfortunately, a lot of noise. People pound their chests about how many suspicious activity reports are being filed, but it's kind of like false positives by software programs at banks that create 10,000 alerts, inside of which there may be 5 real money laundering cases. The fact that you've got 10,000 alerts doesn't mean that you're really doing your job. And the same thing goes with respect to suspicious activity reports. Just because you're filing thousands and thousands of them doesn't necessarily mean that they contain the best information and the best route to finding who's doing this type of stuff.
Bob, that's amazing. We'll put a link to that article. And I mean, we've rapidly run out of time. I could talk to you all day. So I'm going to ask you something here, and I hope you have an answer that we can implement. I would ask you, is there anything that we as individuals can do?
Yes. You know, the old saying, if you see something, say something. My best example of that, during the undercover operation, we were using a private jet to fly around the United States to pick up $1 million, $2 million at a time. And on one occasion, my partner flew into Houston. I had given him a credit card to be able to buy jet fuel. And he hadn't realized that he'd gone over the limit. So now they were getting ready to leave and they needed about $2,000 worth of jet fuel. And they said, well, the credit card's no good. So as he stood on the tarmac with 3 huge suitcases and opened one of them up, where it was plain that there were stacks and bricks of cash, he pulled out one of the bricks and he said, how much do you need? And he gave him the money. And then he threw him another couple of $100 as a tip, put the money back in the suitcases, went onto the plane. Now you would think that they might call the police. Well, the next time they came, my partner went back to Houston to that same fixed base operator. As he got off the plane, they rolled out a red carpet. They brought a tray with champagne and fruit and welcomed him back to Houston. Nobody ever called the cops because this was an opportunity for them to make a couple of bucks. So if I can think of anything, you know, I would think of that. But those who are in the professionals who are in the anti-money laundering compliance world, the number one thing I would have to say to them is that they need to continually remember how strong their individual voice is and not to be taken back by a feeling that they are just one of many, 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 many people and they really can't make a difference. Yes, they can. They absolutely can. Just look at the whistleblowers around the world who have made a difference. Look at what the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists have done through whistleblowers. Look at the Panama Papers. Look at all the other things that have happened. That's what we need to do. And we need to, I know it's very difficult in many parts of the world to embrace whistleblowers. After World War II, there are a lot of reasons why in certain countries, I think whistleblowers are maybe not looked at in the same fashion as they are maybe today in the United States. And to pay them huge amounts of money is something that I think people find distasteful. But without whistleblowers, I'm afraid to say that there is no master plan that I know of right now that's really uncovering the big stuff. And they are extremely important. And every single professional involved in this fight is absolutely important to the success of the mission.
I like that. I like the fact that an individual can make a difference. Thank you so much, Bob.
You're welcome. My pleasure.